Hello, and welcome back to the World of Wysteria. This evening, I will be reading Chapter 11. Wysteria, Chapter 11. The next morning, Will spent nearly an hour lying in bed, thinking about their eventful evening. It began like a fairy tale, he thought, waking up in a castle next to a princess. But with the Drifters' invasion, the story quickly took a frightening turn. Though it was an unwanted episode, he was pleased with how he'd handled himself, and glad Emily was there to witness his performance. He then began reflecting on his discussion with Emily about traveling. He believed he now had a working understanding of the concepts and mechanics involved in building, but traveling still seemed very mysterious to him. Was it something he would ever be able to do? Perhaps with Emily's help? Could she drag him to another world with her? Probably not. He assumed that the draggee had to be a traveler. As he thought more about their conversation, he recalled Emily's parting words, that she could have been in big trouble had that drifter gotten his hands on her. At the time, he assumed she was referring to physical harm, but now he realized she might have meant something else, something far more troubling. For according to her, it was possible to pull dreamers from one world to another against their will. Could that villain have kidnapped her? The thought of him capturing Emily and taking her off to another world, a world ruled by a perverted lunatic, to use her words, made Will sick to his stomach. What about me, he thought. Could I be abducted? Not being a traveler, he assumed he was safe, firmly anchored to his world. But what if he did learn to travel? Would the ability to visit other worlds put him at risk of being torn from his own? Would it be worth the risk, he wondered? It might be. That afternoon, as he sat on the back porch eating a late lunch, Will began making plans for the festival he'd promised his citizens. He envisioned the square filled with large tents, colorful banners flying in the breeze, tables for people to sit, eat, and socialize. What about the entertainment, he thought? Jugglers? Musicians? There would have to be dancing, of course. How about a maypole? But then, was it May? Was it spring? Were there seasons in Wysteria? Will knew what Emily would say if he asked her. Yes, he said to himself, we'll have a maypole. Then later, maybe a bonfire. But wait, that would mean, how would he go about doing that? Will grinned. I wonder. It would involve the manipulation of time itself. The passage of time seemed rather capricious in normal dreams. Hours could race by in minutes, night could suddenly become day. But in Wysteria, time seemed as stable, as internally consistent as the other three spatial dimensions, though it certainly passed at a much faster rate, measured by the clocks here in the waking world. Will began wondering how a clock in Wysteria would record the movement of time. If he were wearing a watch, which he never did in either world, would it measure dream time or time as it passed in the waking world. Interesting, he thought. He got up from the table, walked inside, and climbed the stairs to his room. Once there, he went straight to his dresser and opened the top drawer. Pushing aside a pile of socks, he pulled out an old wooden cigar box, opened it, and scanned the contents. "Here we go," he said, reaching inside and retrieving a tarnished brass pocket watch. "I hope it still works." Will wound the timepiece and saw the second hand beginning to move around the face. Then, after setting it to the correct time, he slipped it into the left pocket of his jeans. Would it come with him tonight? "I guess we'll see," he said. Will spent much of the afternoon and evening pondering the temporal puzzle, and by the time he went to bed, he'd come up with a plan. It would require the creation of a new structure in the town, but that was relatively easy, just some rearranging of things. It was only the first step, however. Arriving in the street near the garden entrance, Will went directly to the square. There, he found his citizens hard at work, readying the plaza for tomorrow's celebration. "This all seems to be coming along nicely," he said to himself. Now, looking up and to his left, he saw a new building rising from the center of the western wall above the gateway. A tall stone tower. The structure was square, 15 feet in width, and stood nearly 4 stories high. At the top was a circular clock face, 10 feet in diameter, with 2 large hands, both pointing straight up. "So it's noon, is it?" he thought. "Or does it just say that because it's new? Like a digital clock flashing 12 when you first plug it in." Will couldn't help laughing out loud. Still, he wondered if that was the real time. Was it actually noon here? Since it always seemed to be the same time of day in Wysteria, no matter how many hours had passed, he'd never given it any thought. It was up to him, he supposed. Okay, it's noon here, he decided. It seemed logical. The sun was high and slightly to the south. But as he continued gazing up at the tower, Will realized that something was wrong. Both hands on the clock were still exactly vertical. Shouldn't the minute hand have moved by now? Surely at least a couple of minutes had passed since he'd first looked at the face. Was the clock not working? Or was it correct? Was it now, and would it always be noon in his world? In either case, his plan had little, more likely no, chance of success. "Although," he said, struck by a thought. Will reached into his pocket and pulled out the watch he'd placed there earlier that day. It had come with him, and according to his timepiece, it was now 1:25. He'd gone to bed around 1 a.m., so that would make sense if it were according time in the waking world. The second hand was moving, and it appeared to be moving at the correct speed. He used the time-honored 1 Mississippi method to check this. So, what time is it here, he wondered. He looked again at the upright hands on the clock tower. "Well, let's try this," he said, setting the time on his watch to 12. The second hand continued to tick, and after watching it trace several circles, Will saw that the minute hand was moving as well. Good, he thought, feeling some relief. There was still hope. The clock on the tower might not be working, or perhaps it had to be wound, but at least his watch seemed to be marking the passage of time in Wysteria. As Will turned to begin a tour of the square, he happened to glance up at the clock tower and was shocked by what he saw. "What?" he gasped. The minute hand had moved. The clock now read a few minutes past the hour, the same time as his watch. How? And why? He wondered, more baffled than before. But whatever the reason, both clocks seemed to be functioning. Though it went against his nature, Will decided to leave it at that and move on, reminding himself that the clocks were simply a means to a much more important end. When Will first began planning the festival, his intention was to create it in the same way he'd built the garden. He would picture the setting and expect it to be there, completed, when he arrived. But he then decided to take an indirect approach, allowing the townspeople to handle the construction. It was an experiment. He was curious to see if they could bring his attentions to life. He also liked the idea of the populace being involved in the preparations. After all, it was their festival, in their town. And they did it, he thought, more than satisfied with everything he saw today. The citizens were taking care of everything, setting up pavilions, erecting stages, hauling in and arranging tables and benches. Long silk banners and floral garlands had been hung from the sills of upper-story windows. He saw several people struggling with a large pole wrapped in long colored ribbons and topped with a bouquet of purple and white flowers. Yes, the maypole. It was all coming together as planned, for the most part. It certainly captured the spirit of his intention, though many of the details surprised him. He noticed that individuals often took great care in how they placed and arranged things, making choices that seemed carefully thought out and entirely their own. At one point, two men had a difference of opinion about which direction one of the stages should face. Will watched while they discussed the issue. After several minutes, they came to an agreement and got back to work. Are these people really nothing but puppets dancing on mental strings? He wondered. Every so often throughout the afternoon, Will glanced at the clock tower and checked his watch, making sure the two timepieces continued to run and agree, both with each other and with the light in the sky. And it seemed they were measuring time accurately. That is, when the clock showed an hour had passed, it felt as if an hour had gone by. Time was passing, and the plaza had been transformed for the festival. A successful day, so far, he thought. Before long, it was nearly 7 o'clock. And most of the townspeople had left. Though their work was finished, a few still lingered, talking with friends or packing up tools. Soon, he said, noting the time. Will left the square and proceeded down the street to the garden doors. He pushed one of them open, just far enough for him to step through. Then, after shutting it behind him, He walked over to the railing on the western side of the terrace. The sun hung low, just a hand-width above the treetops, deep golden yellow against a rich blue sky, casting long shadows in the garden below. I did it, he thought, staring at the horizon. Night would come to Wysteria. Taking a seat on the nearest bench, he watched the sun creep closer to the edge of his world, coloring the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. And there he remained until it fell behind the distant hills. Were there more lands in the far west experiencing daylight for the first time? What are the true boundaries of my kingdom, he wondered. Was Wysteria a planet? Like Earth, did it rotate while revolving around a star? Perhaps it did, now. Very impressive, he heard a deep voice pronounce from behind him. Startled, Will turned his head. A man, arms crossed on his chest, stood near the entrance. Very impressive indeed, said the stranger, staring past Will at the last vestige of crimson light hovering above the trees. Following a moment of silence, the man looked at Will and smiled. Excuse the interruption, he said with a civil nod. Though Will couldn't remember seeing this person before, he appeared to be a citizen of Wysteria. Pleasant enough, and wearing clothes that seemed appropriate. Dark pants and shoes, a gray silk shirt with small pearl buttons, and a long black jacket, somewhat formal, but with a comfortable cut. It's okay, said Will, returning a polite smile. I was just surprised. I didn't hear the door open. Of course not, the man remarked. You seemed quite lost in your thoughts. He paused to push a lock of dark hair from his cheek and tuck it behind his ear. Your sunset was quite stunning. I'm glad someone was here to witness it, said Will, speaking truthfully. The stranger's expression turned serious. I understand. All too well, he said, staring into Will's eyes. Then his smile returned. I must be off now. Enjoy the rest of your evening, my lord. And you as well, said Will. The celebration tomorrow. Will you be there? Perhaps, he replied. In any case, I hope we'll have the occasion to speak again. Soon. The man made a slight bow and turned to go, but then stopped and looked back at Will. By the way, he said, that was very clever. But did you consider a sundial? He smiled and winked. Just a thought. And with that, he took his leave. And thank you for joining me tonight, and we will return shortly with Chapter 12.